In 1939, Germany stood on the brink of a new war. The world still remembered the horrors of the First World War, but the Nazi Reich was already openly preparing for revenge. The Treaty of Versailles, which forbade the Germans to build a strong fleet, had turned into a mere scrap of paper. Hitler sought to show the whole world that Germany was once again a great naval power, and the symbol of this revival was to be a gigantic battleship, a vessel the likes of which the world had never seen. In Hamburg, at the Blohm and Voss shipyard, under an atmosphere of strict secrecy, the steel and riveted hull of a ship destined to enter history was rising. Workers labored day and night, feeling that they were creating not just a machine of war, but a symbol of national pride. Rumors of the monstrous size and incredible power of the new battleship spread throughout the city, while British and French intelligence desperately tried to glean the slightest information about what was happening in the German docks. On February 14, 1939, an event took place that became a true celebration for all of Germany. A huge crowd gathered in Hamburg, officers of the Kriegsmarine, party leaders, shipyard workers with their families. Speeches about the new strength of the Reich resounded from the stands. A band played marches, and red flags with swastikas fluttered in the wind. Then the moment came. The steel colossus slowly moved and, sliding down the slipway, touched the waters of the Elbe. The crowd roared as thousands of eyes watched the ship of more than 50,000 tons enter the water. People understood. A legend had been born. A monster of the ocean had been created. It was given the name Bismarck, in honor of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who had once created the German Empire. The name became not just a designation, but a challenge. The new Reich sought to show continuity with past greatness. Among officers and sailors, it was said that such a name obligated the ship to be invincible. Contemporaries were astonished by its scale. Nearly 250 meters long, 36 meters wide, with armor up to 32 centimeters thick, and 8 380-millimeter guns capable of firing over tens of kilometers. Next to it, even large warships looked like toys. Unsurprisingly, even before construction was complete, legends began to form around the Bismarck. It was called unsinkable. People claimed it could destroy several British battleships in a single battle, and that its speed would allow it to slip from any pursuit. For German sailors, serving on this ship was an honor. The crew was only just forming, but young midshipmen dreamed of getting aboard to become part of history. Even the senior officers admitted that Germany had never had anything like it before. Thus, in 1939, there appeared a ship whose name became, even before its first cruise, a symbol of fear for some and of pride for others. The Bismarck had not yet fired a single shot, but it had already become an embodiment of the Reich's power and a challenge to Britain. Its birth was the beginning of a legend that would soon turn into one of the most dramatic naval stories of the Second World War. When Germany built the Bismarck in the late 1930s, engineers set themselves the task of creating not just a battleship, but a true steel symbol meant to inspire fear by its very appearance. Its dimensions stunned the imagination. Nearly 250 meters long and 36 meters wide. This was a floating city capable of accommodating more than 2,000 sailors. The ship's displacement exceeded 50,000 tons, making it one of the heaviest warships of its time. But the main thing about the Bismarck was not only its scale, but the combination of power, speed, and protection. Its heart was 8 main caliber guns, 380-millimeter cannons mounted in 4 twin turrets. Each gun weighed more than an entire tank and could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton to distances of up to 36 kilometers. A single salvo could decide the outcome of a battle, and it was these guns that soon became famous for sending the British battle cruiser Hood to the bottom. The second element of its strength was its armor. German designers did everything to make the ship as survivable as possible. The main belt reached 320 millimeters in thickness, and the deck and turrets were protected so thoroughly that even the heaviest shells struggled to penetrate. In essence, it was a floating fortress capable of withstanding a hail of enemy fire and continuing the fight. Later, during the Bismarck's final battle, this was confirmed. Despite hundreds of hits, the ship held out to the end, and its armor remained almost undamaged. But the Bismarck was not only strong and tough, it was also fast. For its size, it could make up to 30 knots, nearly 55 kilometers per hour. This made it an elusive hunter. It could catch any merchant convoy and escape most heavy warships. In those years, it was believed that a battleship of such size should not be so fast, and it was precisely this combination, enormous firepower, near impenetrable protection, and high speed, that made the Bismarck unique. In addition to the main guns, it had powerful secondary armament. 12 150-millimeter guns intended for fighting cruisers and destroyers, as well as anti-aircraft weaponry that included dozens of rapid-fire guns of various calibers. The Germans understood that the main threat came from the air, so they tried to saturate the ship with anti-aircraft means, although time showed that aviation nonetheless became its chief enemy. Even inside, the Bismarck impressed with its organization. For a crew of 2,000, there were barracks, cabins, mess halls, medical bays, power stations, boiler rooms, storerooms, and workshops operated there. The ship was like a small autonomous city that could live for weeks, cut off from land. Contemporaries called the Bismarck a technological marvel, and not without reason. Its characteristics placed it among the strongest battleships in the world. The British believed that only their pride, the Hood, could be its rival. But history soon showed that the comparison turned out to be tragically not in Britain's favor. Thus, the Bismarck was not merely a warship, but a steel giant, combining the strength of a fortress, the speed of a cruiser, and artillery power, equal to an entire squadron. This is what made it a true legend even before it entered its first battle. The Bismarck's crew numbered more than 2,000. It was a true floating city where everyone had their place and task, and life was subject to strict discipline. Serving on the Bismarck was considered an honor. Many officers and sailors of the Kriegsmarine dreamed of joining the legendary battleship's crew. Even in Germany itself, where propaganda exalted the ship as a symbol of the Reich's revival, people said that only the best of the best would set foot on its decks. The atmosphere inside the ship combined the rigor of a war machine with a spirit of brotherhood. Sailors lived in cabins or berthing areas with two-tier bunks, whose cramped conditions were compensated by the awareness that they were part of something great. Officers had separate cabins, more comfortable, though modest by the standards of life ashore. On board were mess halls, galleys, medical bays, workshops, and storerooms, everything for the crew to live for weeks far from land. A sailor's day began with reveille and inspection. The entire schedule was strictly regulated: drills, system checks, servicing of guns, work in the engine rooms. German meticulousness reigned on the Bismarck. Everything had to be perfect, from the shine of the deck to the operation of the mechanisms. Any mistake could cost lives, and everyone understood this. But beyond service, there was life. Sailors gathered in wardrooms, socialized, listened to music, played board games. In the evenings, laughter and conversation could be heard in the corridors. Some remembered home, some argued about politics, some simply dreamed of returning after victory. Many kept letters from loved ones and photographs as talismans. Officers maintained high morale in the crew. Not only professionals served on the Bismarck, but very young sailors, 18 or 19 years old. For them, the ship was a first serious trial. Senior comrades taught the young, explained the subtleties of naval service, and shared experience. Gradually, the crew became a single family bound by a common fate. Life aboard was defined by the ship itself. In the engine rooms, hundreds worked, servicing the turbines that could drive the Giant to 30 knots. Artillerymen spent hours in training, preparing for future battles, learning every detail of their guns. Anti-aircraft crews practiced constantly, knowing that the enemy would come first from the sky. Navigators and radiomen watched the course and messages, because any signal could mean mortal danger. All this took place in a confined space where 2,000 people lived side by side, sharing joys and hardships. Sea life forgave no weakness. Rolling seas, the noise of machinery, tight quarters, constant fatigue, all this became routine. Yet it was in these conditions that the resilience was forged, which would reveal itself in the final battle. Service on the Bismarck was hard, but every sailor understood. He was part of a legend. This ship was Germany's pride, and every seaman, mechanic, or officer felt the weight of that responsibility. In conversations, sailors often repeated, "We serve on the best ship in the world." For them, the Bismarck was not just a battleship, but a symbol, almost a living being to which they entrusted their lives. It was precisely this cohesion of the crew and belief in the ship's invincibility that played a huge role in how the Bismarck fought in its final cruise. Even when the steel giant was riddled by hundreds of shells, its men did not break. They remained faithful to the end. When speaking of the Bismarck's place in the Third Reich's naval strategy, it is important to understand that Germany initially did not expect to win the naval war in the traditional sense. It had neither numerical superiority nor an established network of bases comparable to the British Empire's. The Reich's policy in the interwar and early war periods was shaped by several factors: the Versailles restrictions of 1919, the leadership's revanchist ambitions, admirals' aspirations, and limited industrial capacity to build a large fleet at the same time as supporting the Army and Air Force. The official program for naval rebuilding and expansion was called Plan Z, a large-scale plan for building surface ships, approved in the late 1930s and, in fact, slated for years after 1945. Under Plan Z, Germany planned to have modern battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. However, the reality of war and the priority of land operations made the plan impossible to implement on schedule. As a result, by the time hostilities began, the Kriegsmarine possessed only limited surface strength, and strategists sought ways to achieve maximum effect with minimal resources. The ideology and doctrine of German naval command were based on the concept of economic warfare. The goal was not so much to wage a sea battle to destroy the British fleet as to undermine the enemy's maritime logistics, to destroy merchant convoys, depriving Britain of fuel, food, and raw materials. For this role, the main bet was placed on submarines, U-boats, which formed a separate arm, designed to wage a prolonged campaign of merchant tonnage destruction. But submarine warfare alone could not deliver a short-term political military effect. Surface forces, though few, could act as a diversion, forcing Britain to redistribute forces, mobilizing carriers and battleships to chase and destroy raiders, which in turn would ease the work of the U-boats. It was within this concept that the Bismarck appeared. It was built as a heavy surface raider, a ship with high firepower, 8 380mm main guns, serious armor protection, and sufficient speed, about 30 knots, to attack convoys and, if necessary, break contact. The Bismarck was meant to act not as the core of a battle line engaging the enemy fleet, but as a mobile striking fist, fast, powerful, and psychologically impactful. Its appearance in the Atlantic was supposed to force the British Admiralty to keep costly forces ready, carriers, battleships, and escorts, which diverted resources from anti-submarine warfare and weakened convoy protection. In practice, this took shape in concrete designs. The operation codenamed Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, envisaged the Bismarck and its consort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, breaking into the open Atlantic to hunt convoys. The plan required secrecy, a swift transit through the North Sea, and the use of bases on the coast of occupied Europe, Norwegian and French ports, were planned as support points, while also counting on the ship's ability to operate autonomously for a considerable time. The cruise route, departure times, and refueling were carefully planned. The German command understood that a single surface raider had to act economically and stealthily, avoiding contact with large enemy forces unless a favorable target presented itself. Political military calculations also included a personnel component. The Kriegsmarine Command, at the time of construction and commissioning, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder; at sea, Admiral Günther Lutyens as task group commander, regarded the Bismarck not merely as a ship, but as a propaganda instrument. Sending it on a raid was meant to show Germans and Allied nations that the Reich could challenge British maritime supremacy, influencing morale both in Germany and abroad. Therefore, preparation for the cruise paid attention not only to tactical and technical details, but also to elements of secrecy and deception to create uncertainty for the enemy. The Bismarck's technical capabilities largely determined its tactical use. High speed allowed it to intercept merchant ships and evade escorts. Powerful artillery could, in a short fight, destroy cruisers and light destroyers. Robust armor protection allowed it to withstand return fire while breaking away from a convoy and, if necessary, hold out until reinforcements came. But even in planning, vulnerabilities were obvious. Limited stocks of aviation fuel and anti-submarine means, insufficient endurance compared to well-supplied British bases, vulnerability to air attack, and difficult logistics for resupply and repair of heavy damage at far ranges. All this meant that the Bismarck could be effective only as part of a combined strategy in which submarines, mines, auxiliary cruisers, and diplomatic efforts to secure bases in Norway and France created conditions for its operations. Finally, An important strategic fact. The Bismarck's appearance forced Britain to act not locally, but to mobilize on a large scale. The sinking of the British battle cruiser Hood in the Battle of the Denmark Strait on May 24, 1941, was a political and military shock, and the Royal Navy's reaction was unprecedented. Through every available channel, a hunt for the Bismarck was declared, throwing significant squadrons, carriers, destroyers, and air forces into the search and destruction. This obsessive concentration of forces and resources on pursuing a single surface raider was part of Germany's initial idea, to force the enemy to expend combat forces in a way that made the U-boats and other raiders' work easier. In practice, however, a combination of technical problems, vulnerability to aviation, and a coordinated British response led to the conclusion that a single ship, no matter how powerful, could not change the outcome of the naval campaign. The Bismarck became an instrument of tactical and psychological impact, but not a strategic solution in the war at sea. In short, the Bismarck was conceived and used as a powerful yet autonomous instrument of Germany's surface campaign, a means of attacking trade, diverting British forces, and demonstrating the Reich's might for propaganda. Its strength and technological sophistication should not be underestimated, but the Third Reich's strategic logic and the reality of war showed that a single battleship, without a broad infrastructure and dominant air defense, could not turn the maritime situation in its favor. In May 1941, the Bismarck was ready for its first combat operation. The mission was codenamed Rheinübung, Rhine exercise. Despite the innocent name, the task was anything but training. The ship was to break into the Atlantic, where it would hunt British merchant convoys. Working alongside the Bismarck was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, one of the Kriegsmarine's best ships. The operation was led by Admiral Günther Lütjens, a man of great experience and cool head, and the ship's captain was Ernst Lindemann, an officer held in high esteem by the crew. May 18, 1941. In the evening, the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen left the port of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland. The operation began under strict secrecy. To conceal the departure, the Germans employed smoke screens, camouflage, and deceptive radio transmissions. According to plan, the ships were to pass through the Danish Straits into the North Sea, then break toward Iceland and out into the Atlantic. May 21st, the force reached Bergen, Norway. The ships put in for refueling, essentially a forced decision. The Bismarck's range did not allow for extended operations without replenishment. But this stop proved fatal for the operation's secrecy. British reconnaissance Spitfires spotted the German ships, and the information immediately reached the British Admiralty. From that moment, the hunt for the Bismarck began. May 23rd, the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen passed into the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. Waiting for them, there were the British heavy cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, which made contact and began shadowing. Using radar, the British were among the first to employ radars effectively in naval warfare. They kept their distance and transmitted coordinates without engaging. May 24th, a day that entered history. In the Denmark Strait, the German ships met the pride of the Royal Navy, the battlecruiser Hood, and the new battleship Prince of Wales. At 5:52 a.m., the battle began. The Germans opened fire at a range of more than 20 kilometers. Within minutes, a shell from the Bismarck hit Hood's magazine. The explosion was so powerful that the giant ship broke in two and sank in less than 3 minutes. Of 1,418 sailors, only 3 survived. For Britain, it was a national tragedy. Prince of Wales continued the fight, but also took several hits and was forced to withdraw. The Bismarck did not emerge unscathed. British shells pierced fuel tanks, and some of the fuel spilled into the sea. This was a serious blow. Its operational range was now sharply reduced. Admiral Lütjens decided to send Prince Eugen to continue the raid in the Atlantic, while the Bismarck was to head for Brest, France, for repairs. Thus, the German battleship found itself alone in the open ocean, pursued by dozens of British ships, May 25th to 26th. An entire armada chased the Bismarck, the battleships King George V and Rodney, the carrier Ark Royal cruisers and destroyers. The British threw in everything they had. On the night of May 26th, a British Catalina reconnaissance plane spotted the Bismarck. Thereafter, Swordfish torpedo bombers took off from Ark Royal. These biplanes seemed outdated even by the standards of the time, but they proved fateful for the Bismarck. One of the torpedoes struck the stern and jammed the rudders. The ship lost steering and could only circle. It was a death sentence. The steel giant had been deprived of its chief strength, maneuverability. May 27, 1941. In the morning, the British battleships Rodney and King George V approached the Bismarck. A fierce battle ensued. Hundreds of shells rained down on the German battleship. Its turrets fell silent one after another. Superstructures turned into heaps of metal, and the decks were engulfed in fire. But the ship held. Even when almost nothing remained of its artillery, its armor continued to stand, preventing the enemy from completely destroying the hull. At 10:40 a.m., the crew opened the seacocks and detonated charges to scuttle the ship and prevent its capture. The Bismarck slipped beneath the waves with its war flag flying. Of the 2,200-man crew, only 114 were saved. Such was the Bismarck's first and last cruise. It lasted only 9 days, May 18th to May 27th, 1941, but became one of the most vivid and dramatic epics of the Second World War at sea. This raid demonstrated both the ship's strength, capable of destroying the pride of the British fleet, and its vulnerability to aviation and overwhelming enemy forces. Morning of May 24th, 1941, the gray waters of the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. A cold wind drove low clouds. Visibility was variable but good enough to make out ship silhouettes. It was here that a meeting destined to enter naval history was to occur. At 5:37 a.m., the British ships, the battlecruiser Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, and the new battleship Prince of Wales, made visual contact with the German ships Bismarck and Prince Eugen. The British expected a quick, decisive victory. Built in the First World War era, Hood was considered a symbol of the Empire's might. Over 260 meters in length, it was the largest warship of its time and bore the nickname Unsinkable. British society believed in its invulnerability, but the giant had an Achilles heel. Its deck armor was relatively weak. Designed for high-speed battles at short range, Hood was vulnerable to plunging fire at long range. This was to prove fatal. At 5:52 a.m., Vice Admiral Holland ordered fire to be opened. The first salvos from Hood and Prince of Wales struck at the German ships. The British mistakenly took Prince Eugen for the Bismarck and concentrated fire on the cruiser, This gave the Germans valuable time. While the British were firing at the wrong target, the Bismarck refined its aim. At 5:55 a.m., the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen returned fire. The German gunners, drilled to perfection, acted coolly. Each of the Bismarck's turrets weighed dozens of tons, yet worked like clockwork. By the third salvo, Prinz Eugen had hit Hood, igniting a fire on deck. And at 6 a.m., the Bismarck fired the salvo that changed history. One of the 380mm shells pierced Hood's deck and reached the magazine. A monstrous explosion followed. The ship tore apart. The hull broke in two, and within 3 minutes, Hood vanished beneath the icy waters. Of the 1,418 crew, only 3 survived: sailors Ted Briggs, Robert Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. They were picked up by destroyers, but all of Britain went into mourning. The sinking of Hood became the heaviest blow to the Royal Navy's prestige during the war. Meanwhile, Prince of Wales continued the fight. It took several hits to the bridge, the hull, the gun turrets. One of the Bismarck's shells penetrated the armor, killing and wounding dozens in the central fire control position. Despite the damage, the British battleship kept firing, 55 main battery shells in total. Several found their mark. One struck the Bismarck's bow area and pierced fuel tanks, causing thousands of tons of fuel to spill into the ocean. This blow proved critical. Outwardly, the Bismarck looked almost unscathed. Its armor had held up admirably. But the damage to the fuel system meant the ship could no longer sustain a long Atlantic raid. It was the beginning of the end, though none suspected it then. The battle lasted only about 8 minutes, yet became one of the most dramatic in naval history. The British lost their chief pride, Hood, the symbol of imperial sea power. The Germans won, but suffered damage that deprived the Bismarck of a raider's chief weapon, autonomy. After the battle, Admiral Lütjens decided to break off and head the Bismarck to Brest for repairs. Prinz Eugen went into the Atlantic to continue the raiding. The Bismarck remained alone against the entire British fleet. In London, the news of Hood's loss caused a true shock. Churchill uttered the words that became an order for the entire Royal Navy: "Sink the Bismarck." After Hood's loss on May 24, 1941, Great Britain went into shock. The pride of the fleet, the symbol of British sea power, had gone to the bottom in minutes, received as a national catastrophe. But the tragedy became a powerful challenge. Churchill, upon learning what had happened, issued a short order that spread across all Royal Navy radio: "Sink the Bismarck." From that moment, the entire Atlantic turned into the stage for an unprecedented naval operation. The British Admiralty mobilized everything that could put to sea: battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers. Dozens of reconnaissance aircraft took to the skies. Never before had a single ship become the target of such a massive hunt. May 25th. After the Denmark Strait battle, the Bismarck had been damaged. One British shell had pierced fuel tanks in the bow, and fuel leaked into the ocean. This left a trail that could be detected and simultaneously reduced the ship's range. Admiral Lütjens understood. A raid into the Atlantic was no longer possible. He decided to steer the Bismarck to Brest, where Kriegsmarine bases were located. Meanwhile, the British lost contact with the ship. The cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, which had been shadowing the Germans by radar, lost them in the night gloom of May 25th. For several hours, the Bismarck seemed to dissolve into the sea. For the British, this was a disaster. They realized that if the German made Brest, it would be repaired and returned to the hunt. Churchill was furious. The Admiralty began redeploying forces, building a true comb of ships along the Bismarck's probable route. Everything was used: radio intelligence, air patrols, track calculations. May 26th. In the morning, the German battleship was spotted from the air. An American Catalina reconnaissance plane, though the U.S. had not yet entered the war, Americans assisted the Allies in the Atlantic, sighted the Bismarck, and relayed coordinates. This became the turning point. Toward evening, the carrier Ark Royal joined the action, launching Swordfish torpedo bombers. These biplanes looked like an anachronism, slow, with fabric-covered wings, reminiscent of First World War machines, but they became a mortal threat. The first attack failed. By mistake, the pilots took a British cruiser for the enemy and nearly torpedoed their own. But the second wave struck the Bismarck accurately. At 21:05, one torpedo hit the battleship's stern. The explosion damaged the steering gear. The rudders jammed to starboard, and the ship lost maneuverability. It could now move only in a circle or a broad curve. This was a mortal wound for the giant. Speed and maneuverability had been its chief weapons, and now it was nearly a sitting target. Through the night of May 26th to 27th, the Bismarck was encircled by British destroyers, which attacked with torpedoes, giving the crew no rest. Despite every effort, the Germans could not fix the rudders. The crew understood. The end was near. A heavy silence reigned aboard. Sailors prepared for the final battle. Captain Lindemann told his officers, "Kriegsmarine sailors know how to die with dignity." The British, for their part, strained every sinew. By morning, the battleships King George V and Rodney, cruisers and destroyers, were hurrying to the site. The hunt was over. The encircled Bismarck would have to fight its last battle. May 27, 1941 became the day when the legend ended its journey. After aircraft from Ark Royal had damaged the steering gear the day before, the Bismarck was practically immobilized. It could no longer maneuver and moved only along a curve, losing the ability to escape the enemy. For the British, this was the signal. The moment had come for the final blow. At dawn, the battleships Rodney and King George V approached the Bismarck, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers. Their goal was the complete destruction of the German giant. The forces were unequal: 2 modern British battleships and an entire squadron against a single damaged ship. Yet, despite the hopelessness, the Bismarck's crew prepared to meet the enemy. When the first salvos thundered, the ocean seemed to shudder. The British ships unleashed dozens of heavy shells on the enemy. Explosions tore at the decks and superstructures. Fires broke out across the ship. But the German guns replied. The Bismarck's turrets roared, sending tons of steel and fire toward the foe. The gunners fought to the last, even as their comrades fell at their sides. With each new hit, the ship lost strength. Its turrets fell silent one by one. Decks turned into piles of wreckage. The bridge was destroyed, but the hull held. The armor belt crafted by German engineers withstood the storm of shells, and the Bismarck still did not sink. It seemed invincible, even in its agony. Then the British employed torpedoes. Several hits upset the battleship's stability, and it began to list. A decision was made aboard to scuttle the ship themselves. The Germans opened the seacocks and set charges, unwilling to surrender the Bismarck to the enemy. Soon the Colossus began to sink. Its stern rose from the water. The hull rolled, and moments later it disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves. Even in its final minutes, the battle flag fluttered from the mast. It was an exit with honor. The ship fell not defeated, but scuttled by its own crew. Of more than 2,000 sailors, only a little over 100 survived. The rest found eternal rest on the ocean floor with their ship. For Britain, it was a long-awaited victory won at a high price. For Germany, a tragedy and the loss of the fleet's pride. Thus ended the Bismarck's first and last cruise. Its story spanned only a few days, but entered history forever as an example of unyielding resistance and a symbol of the end of the battleship era. The battleship Bismarck entered history not only through its battles and its demise, but also through the multitude of myths that surrounded its name even in its lifetime. These legends turned the ship into a symbol, almost a mythical being, an invincible sea titan that inspired fear and respect even among enemies. One of the most popular myths is the unsinkability of the Bismarck. When the ship was launched, Nazi propaganda actively instilled the idea that its armor was impenetrable, its speed unreachable, and its guns capable of destroying any enemy. Even British sailors sometimes spoke anxiously, "If it gets into the Atlantic, no convoy will be safe." The truth was more complex. The Bismarck did indeed possess outstanding protection. Its armor belt withstood the blows of the heaviest shells. Yet it was vulnerable to aviation, and it was precisely a torpedo hit to the steering gear that sealed its fate. Thus, the invincible giant fell victim to old swordfish biplanes, which seemed almost a joke of fate. Another myth is that the British sank the Bismarck. For many years, it was believed that the Royal Navy destroyed the ship with gunfire and torpedoes. But the 1989 expedition by Robert Ballard, who discovered the wreck at a depth of nearly 5 kilometers, showed that the Bismarck's hull remained almost intact. The main armor belts were not penetrated. This indicated that it was ultimately sent to the bottom by its own crew, who opened the seacocks and set scuttling charges. Britain won the victory, but the Germans preserved their honor by sinking their ship themselves. There was also the legend of the Bismarck's supernatural luck. On its first and only cruise, it sank the Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, considered a symbol of its invincibility. For the British, this was a shock bordering on catastrophe. Many in Britain said the German battleship seemed cursed. Wherever it appeared, death followed. But that luck was short-lived. Within days, the entire Imperial fleet was hunting it, and luck turned to tragedy. There is also the myth that the Bismarck could have changed the course of the war. Some historians and publicists have claimed that if it had broken into the Atlantic and started destroying convoys, Britain might have been brought to its knees by shortages of food and fuel. In reality, however, a single battleship could not overturn the situation in such a vast war. Its successes might have inflicted blows on the British economy, but the decisive factor remained the submarine war. The Bismarck was a symbol, not a weapon of strategic victory. A special place is held by the myth of the crew's heroism. Even enemies acknowledged that the German sailors fought to the end. British officers who witnessed the ship's final moments said the Germans did not surrender, even when the battle was long lost. This created the image of a crew that died with its ship, remaining true to duty. And there is truth to this. Of more than 2,000 sailors, only a little over 100 survived. The rest went into the ocean with their giant. Finally, the Bismarck story became a legend, of the end of the battleship era. Its fate showed that the age of giants with heavy artillery was drawing to a close. Aviation had become the new master of the sea, and no matter how much armor a ship had, the sky would decide its fate. This is both the tragedy and the grandeur of the Bismarck. It became not merely the quarry of a hunt, but a symbol of an era's twilight. Today, decades later, the Bismarck's name still carries a special resonance. It is tinged with fear, admiration, and sorrow. It remains a ship of legend, debated, written about, and filmed. Some see in it a monster of war, others a heroic tragedy. But one thing is certain, the Bismarck has forever remained in memory as a ship that no one simply managed to sink. It went by its own will, by that of its sailors, and in this lies its eternal legend. After the Bismarck's sinking in May 1941, nearly half a century passed before people saw it again. For decades, it remained only a memory, a symbol of tragedy, and a legend surrounded by debate. To some, it was a monster of war. To others, a symbol of the crew's valor as they went to the bottom with their ship. In the post-war years, the Bismarck's name often appeared in books, films, and articles. It was compared to the Titanic of warships, not in the nature of the catastrophe, but in symbolism. The Titanic became a symbol of human pride and helplessness before nature, while the Bismarck symbolized the end of the battleship era, when even the most powerful ship proved powerless before aviation and superior enemy forces. In 1989, American oceanographer Robert Ballard, the very man who found the Titanic, organized an expedition to the Bismarck's resting place. In the cold Atlantic waters, at a depth of nearly 5 kilometers, they found the battleship's hull. What the scientists saw shocked them. Despite hundreds of hits, the Bismarck's main armor remained almost unscathed. Its hull lay on the seabed, majestic and menacing, like a steel monument to a bygone age. Research confirmed what surviving Germans had said. British shells and torpedoes caused terrible destruction to the superstructures, but the Bismarck was ultimately scuttled by its own crew. The Germans opened the sea cocks and set charges, not allowing the enemy to capture the ship. This only strengthened the ship's aura of legend. The Bismarck did not fall to foreign hands, but by the will of its sailors. Today, the Bismarck remains a war grave. More than 2,000 German sailors rest aboard it, and any attempt to raise or disturb the ship is seen as sacrilege. It stands on the seabed as a reminder of the cost of war and of how fragile human pride is before a time in history. Memory of the Bismarck lives not only on the ocean floor. In Germany, Britain, and elsewhere, books and documentaries about its short but vivid fate still appear. Its image shows up in games, films, even songs. For some, it is a symbol of power and pride. For others, of tragedy and the futility of war. But it leaves no one indifferent. The Bismarck made only a single cruise, 9 days, but became an eternal legend. Its name is still spoken with respect, a reminder that even the strongest ship can fall, yet still depart with honor. It was the last great battleship to show the world that the age of steel giants was passing, giving way to a new force, aviation and the submarine fleet. And today, as ocean currents flow around its hull on the Atlantic seabed, the Bismarck remains a symbol of pride and tragedy, courage and death, the end of one era and the beginning of another, a ship that no one simply managed to sink, a ship that became a legend,